In September of 1890, a census taker named William Bradshaw arrived in the small Tennessee town of Millbrook Creek to record its population. He found 43 empty houses, a locked church, and a single-occupied dwelling at the end of Chapel Road. Inside that house, a widow named Lucinda Hale sat alone at a table set for 26 people, an open Bible before her, waiting for guests who would never arrive. When Bradshaw asked where everyone had gone, Mrs. Hale smiled and said they had simply learned to read Scripture properly. Within 2 months, Bradshaw himself would be found dead in his boarding house room, the pages of his census book covered in verses from the book of Revelation, written in his own hand, though he swore he never touched them. Millbrook Creek sat in the valleys of eastern Tennessee, population 214 as of January 1890. The town operated a grist mill, 2 churches, a general store, and a small school that served children from the surrounding farms. Like most communities in that region, religion formed the backbone of daily life. Methodist services on Sunday morning, Baptist services on Sunday evening, and throughout the week, various prayer groups met in homes to study Scripture and support one another. Mrs. Lucinda Hale had lived in Millbrook Creek for 38 years. She married Thomas Hale in 1852, bore him 3 children, and became a widow in 1887 when her husband died of consumption. By 1890, all 3 children had moved away for work opportunities in larger towns. Mrs. Hale remained in the family home on Chapel Road, living on her late husband's property income and the small contribution she received as the town's seamstress. In February of 1890, Mrs. Hale began hosting a weekly Bible study in her home every Wednesday evening. The invitation came from a place of genuine loneliness, according to a letter her daughter Emma wrote to her sister in March. Emma visited that month and later described the gathering as nothing more than a group of 9 women sitting in her mother's parlor, reading passages from 1 Timothy about the proper conduct of widows. Emma wrote that her mother seemed happier than she had been since their father's death, that the Bible study gave her purpose and community. But by April, the nature of these meetings had changed. On April 18, 1890, Reverend Marcus Whitfield of the Methodist Church recorded in his journal an unusual conversation with 3 of his congregants. Mrs. Sarah Brennan, Mrs. Dorothy Fuller, and Mrs. Elizabeth Monroe had approached him after Sunday service to express concern about Mrs. Hale's Bible study. The women reported that the group had grown to 18 members and that Mrs. Hale was no longer reading from traditional passages. Instead, she had developed what she called a new interpretation of Scripture, one that required careful study and practice. Reverend Whitfield wrote that he found this claim troubling but not immediately alarming. Women hosting prayer circles was common practice, and individual interpretation of Scripture, while discouraged by traditional church leadership, was not unheard of in rural Tennessee communities. He advised the 3 women to attend a session themselves before passing judgment. None of the 3 women ever attended Mrs. Hale's Bible study. 2 weeks later, all 3 stopped attending church services entirely. The first documented disappearance in Millbrook Creek occurred on May 3, 1890. James Brennan, husband of Sarah Brennan, reported to the local sheriff that his wife had not returned home from Mrs. Hale's Bible study the previous evening. When Sheriff Coleman Pike went to the Hale residence to investigate, he found Mrs. Hale sitting in her parlor with 17 other women, all silently reading from their Bibles. Mrs. Brennan was among them. Sheriff Pike's report, preserved in the Decatur County Archives, describes a deeply strange encounter. When he asked Mrs. Brennan to return home with him, she looked up from her Bible and said she was exactly where she needed to be. When he demanded to know why she had not come home, she replied that home was wherever the word was properly understood. The other women continued reading throughout this exchange, never looking up from their pages. Sheriff Pike noted that he could not compel Mrs. Brennan to leave since she was an adult woman making her own choice. He left the house confused and frustrated. James Brennan would never see his wife again. Throughout May and June of 1890, 12 more women from Millbrook Creek joined Mrs. Hale's Bible study and subsequently disappeared from their normal lives. They stopped returning to their homes, stopped attending their regular church services, and ceased all communication with their families. Some were widows like Mrs. Hale, but most were married women with children. Their husbands and families attempted numerous times to bring them home, but each woman refused to leave Mrs. Hale's residence. The nature of what actually occurred during these Bible study sessions remains unclear, but several fragmentary accounts offer disturbing glimpses. Dr. Henry Caldwell, the town's only physician, was called to the Hale residence on June 14th after Mr. James Morrison became violent while trying to remove his wife from the premises. In his medical log, Dr. Caldwell described entering the house and finding 19 women seated around Mrs. Hale's expanded dining table. They were not reading from Bibles as Sheriff Pike had described, but instead appeared to be copying text onto long strips of cloth that hung from the walls like banners. Dr. Caldwell wrote that the text was in English, but arranged in patterns that made no grammatical sense. Words stacked vertically, sentences that spiraled in circles, phrases that repeated and overlapped until they became impossible to read as linear statements. When he asked Mrs. Hale what this activity meant, she told him they were learning to read the Bible the way it was truly written, before men had imposed order upon it. The doctor treated Mr. Morrison's injuries, which included a broken nose and severe bruising, sustained when he tried to physically remove his wife from the house. Dr. Caldwell noted in his log that he could not determine who had struck Mr. Morrison, as none of the women appeared to have moved from their seats. By July, the situation in Millbrook Creek had deteriorated into something that transcended religious dispute or domestic concern. 23 women were now living permanently in Mrs. Hale's house, refusing all contact with their former families. The husbands and children they had abandoned began leaving town, some to stay with relatives elsewhere, others simply disappearing into the surrounding territory. A letter dated July 22nd, 1890, from Thomas Fuller to his brother in Nashville, describes the atmosphere in Millbrook Creek as one of pervasive dread. Fuller wrote that the town felt hollow, that even people who had no connection to Mrs. Hale's Bible study group had begun acting strangely. Children refused to play outside. The grist mill had closed because its operator, Mr. Silas Grant, had stopped coming to work, claiming he could hear voices coming from the millstones. The general store remained open but was nearly always empty. Fuller wrote that he could not explain the feeling that had settled over the town, but that it reminded him of the months before the typhoid epidemic of 1884, when everyone seemed to sense something terrible approaching but could not name it. On August 9th, 1890, the 24 women living in Mrs. Hale's house stopped leaving the property entirely. Previously, some had ventured out to collect supplies or maintain minimal contact with the outside world. After August 9th, no one saw any of them outside the house. Neighbors reported that the windows remained lit every night, but curtains obscured any view inside. John Hartley, who lived on Chapel Road, approximately 100 yards from the Hale house, kept a diary during this period. His entries from mid-August describe hearing singing every night, but the songs were not hymns he recognized. He wrote that the melodies seemed familiar, like traditional church music, but the structure was wrong. Verses that went on too long, choruses that repeated at strange intervals, harmonies that created an almost physical sense of discomfort. On August 23rd, Hartley wrote that he had woken at 3 in the morning to the sound of all 24 women singing in perfect unison, and that the song had been completely silent by the time he got to his window to listen. He was certain he had not dreamed it. The last recorded gathering in Millbrook Creek took place on September 1st, 1890. Reverend Whitfield, along with Sheriff Pike and 4 other men from neighboring communities, approached Mrs. Hale's house with the intention of forcibly removing the women and ending what they now considered a dangerous religious sect. They brought a county judge who could authorize intervention on grounds of public safety. The men reported that when they entered the property, they found the front door unlocked. The house was empty. All 24 women were gone. There were no signs of struggle. No indication of where they had gone. The only evidence of their presence was the dining room, where the long table was still set for 26 places with food that appeared freshly prepared. And covering every wall, ceiling, and exposed surface in that dining room were the cloth banners Dr. Caldwell had described, now completely filled with text. The 6 men spent an hour attempting to read the passages, trying to understand what Mrs. Hale and her followers had written. None of them could make sense of it. Judge Silas Morton's official report stated that the text appeared to be biblical in origin, containing recognizable words and phrases from various books of Scripture, but arranged in a way that defied comprehension. He described it as seeing a familiar language transformed into something foreign, as if the alphabet itself had been rearranged while he was looking at it. The men left the house deeply unsettled. Within a week, all 6 of them would begin experiencing the same recurring dream. They were sitting at Mrs. Hale's table, reading from a Bible that had too many pages, and they could not stop turning them, no matter how much they wanted to look away. September of 1890 marked the final collapse of Millbrook Creek. The disappearance of 24 women created an enormous void in the community's social structure. Families left in waves. The remaining businesses closed. By the time census taker William Bradshaw arrived on September 18th, the town had been effectively abandoned. Bradshaw's personal notebook, discovered after his death in November 1890, contains his observations about Millbrook Creek. He described walking through empty streets, finding homes with meals still on tables, laundry hanging on lines, toys lying in yards, all the markers of sudden departure. The only occupied building was the house at the end of Chapel Road. Bradshaw wrote that when he entered Mrs. Hale's home, he found her sitting at the dining table with 25 empty chairs arranged around her. She appeared to be approximately 60 years old, well-dressed and perfectly calm. When he introduced himself and explained his purpose, she welcomed him politely and offered him tea. In his notes, Bradshaw recorded their conversation. He asked where the other residents had gone. Mrs. Hale replied that they had learned to read properly. When he asked what she meant, she told him that most people only saw the surface of Scripture, that they read words in order from left to right, from top to bottom, never understanding that truth operated in multiple directions at once. Bradshaw wrote that he found this statement deeply strange, but could not articulate why. He asked if she intended to leave town. Mrs. Hale said she was waiting for her students to return. When he pointed out that the town was abandoned, she smiled and said that abandonment was only a matter of perspective. Before he left, Mrs. Hale gave Bradshaw a piece of advice. She told him that if he ever felt the urge to write in his census book outside of working hours, he should not resist it. She said resistance would only make the process more difficult. Bradshaw did not understand what she meant at the time. The census taker returned to his boarding house in the neighboring town of Parsons and attempted to file his report on Millbrook Creek. Over the next 6 weeks, he experienced increasingly severe episodes of involuntary writing. He would wake to find pages of his census book filled with biblical passages he did not remember writing. He would lose hours of time during the day, coming back to consciousness with ink-stained hands and more pages covered in verses. His landlady, Mrs. Vera Hopkins, testified at the inquest that Bradshaw had become frantic by late October. He nailed his census book shut inside a wooden box, but this did not stop the episodes. He began writing on the walls of his room, on his bed sheets, on his own skin. Mrs. Hopkins said the verses were always from Revelation, always about judgment and transformation. On November 2nd, 1890, Mrs. Hopkins entered Bradshaw's room to bring him breakfast and found him dead at his writing desk. His census book lay open before him, though the nails and box were still intact in the corner of the room. Every single page contained text written in Bradshaw's hand. The county coroner ruled the death as heart failure brought on by exhaustion. The census book was destroyed by fire in 1891 at the request of Bradshaw's family. Mrs. Lucinda Hale remained in her house in Millbrook Creek until at least 1895, according to tax records. After that year, no further documentation of her existence can be found. The house itself stood empty for decades before being demolished in 1934. Of the 24 women who disappeared from Millbrook Creek in September 1890, not one was ever located. No bodies were found. No reports surfaced of them living elsewhere under new identities. No evidence suggested what might have happened to them. They simply ceased to exist in any official capacity the moment they left Mrs. Hale's house. In 1903, a group of historians from the Tennessee Historical Society attempted to study the Millbrook Creek incident as part of a larger project documenting abandoned communities. They visited the Hale property and reported that the house, though empty for years, still contained the cloth banners in the dining room. The historians attempted to photograph the text for their records, but every photograph came out blank. When they tried to remove a banner to take back to Nashville for analysis, all 3 historians became violently ill and had to abandon the project. The lead historian, Dr. Marcus Brennan, wrote in his journal that standing in that dining room created an overwhelming sensation of being watched by something that existed at the edges of human perception. He described feeling as though he was reading words he could not see, understanding concepts that had no name in any language he knew. Dr. Brennan's journal ends abruptly on the day of his return from Millbrook Creek. He never completed his study and never spoke publicly about his experience. The site where Millbrook Creek once stood is now part of a state forest preserve. The roads are gone, the buildings are gone. Even the Mill Creek itself was diverted in 1947 for a water management project. But occasionally, hikers in that region report finding long strips of cloth hanging from trees, covered in text that looks like English but can't quite be read properly. In 2019, a graduate student from Vanderbilt University named Jennifer Morrison submitted a thesis on abandoned religious communities in East Tennessee. Her research included a section on Millbrook Creek based on documents she claimed to have found in the Decatur County archives. The thesis committee rejected her work, stating that the documents she cited did not exist and appeared to have been fabricated. Morrison insisted the documents were real, that she had spent weeks photographing them, that the archive staff had helped her locate them. When the committee asked her to produce the photographs, she showed them hundreds of images of what appeared to be blank pages. Morrison claimed the text was clearly visible in person but somehow did not translate to digital format. She withdrew from the university's program 3 weeks later. According to her last social media post before deleting all her accounts, Morrison wrote that she had finally learned to read the documents properly. She said it just required looking at them from multiple directions at once. No one has heard from her since.